Does anybody know the real you? So as you think about it, I'm talking about not the part that you necessarily want us to know. I'm talking about the parts of us that maybe we seem to be the only ones who know. And maybe even we deny that some of those things are true. Is there anybody in your life, maybe a spouse, maybe a really, really close friend, that knows the real you? Every human being longs to be known, to be truly known for who they really are, the authentic self. But the problem is that so many of us, when we look at the real us, when we look at who we really are, we don't always think that person would be accepted. That person would be liked. That person would be somebody that somebody else would want to be around. And so what happens is we create something that is known as the false self. The false self. So what I mean is we create a version of ourselves. So it's still us, but we create a version of ourselves that we think you will like. We create a version of ourselves that is, in a sense, an image. We project an image of the person that we think you'll accept, you will like, and you will want to be around. That's called the false self. And I would say most of us, most human beings, have at some point in their life created this false self. You can call it a chameleon, you can call it kind of trying to fit in, but many of us project or create this image of ourselves that's not true. Now, there's a couple of issues with that. There's a couple problems with it. It sets up a number of things. First of all, it sets up something called imposter syndrome. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. You wonder, will people ever find out that I don't know what I'm doing around here? Will people ever find out that maybe I'm not as good as I project myself to be? And I know sometimes as a pastor I have felt this imposter syndrome, like, oh man, if people really knew, right? If they knew the real me, I don't know if they'd want to even hear a word I had to say, right? It's this imposter syndrome. So it's this sense that we feel like we're an imposter in our own lives. It also tends to set up a sense of hiding, where we try to kind of keep parts of us off to the side. We try to hide parts of us that we don't think will be acceptable, we don't think you'll like, and so we hide certain things. And it's not that we lie, it's not that we are going around, but we color the truth, or we only share part of the truth, so that, because we know that part of the truth you can handle, and you can't handle the real truth, right? And then what often happens with that is we get this sense of isolation. We start to avoid certain social dynamics. We try to stick on the surface of small talk, and we hope that nobody really asks us, hey, how you doing today? I'm sure you've already asked that question multiple times today, right? Hey, how are you? And what do? Oh, I'm great, or I'm fine. Hey, it's good. Good to be alive. And we're all hoping, right, that nobody asks a follow-up. No. How are you really? And to want to avoid going too deep with anybody. And then that can lead to some secrets, and that can lead to some deception. Sometimes deception to ourselves, where we lie to ourselves. So it's not like we're lying to you, it's just we don't even accept the truth about ourselves. And it all is surrounded around this false self. But we construct this false self because we learn really early what it's like to be rejected, and nobody wants to be rejected. And so we portray or create a version of ourselves that we think other people will like, and then we just live that out. And some of us, by the way, have been living this false self out for so long that we don't even know who the real self is. In fact, as I'm saying this, some of you are like, I don't know where Jason's going with this. I don't even get this. Because what's happened is we've lived this version of ourselves for so long that when we say, who's the real you, we have a hard time really accessing that. But I want to tell you one of the most difficult things about this, because as I started to say, really for me, probably in junior high and high school, I created this false self, this image, And then I got into ministry, and there's high expectations of a pastor to look like he's got it together and all of that. And I fell hook, line, and sinker for that in my early 20s and 30s, that I just really worked so hard to put up an image like I had things together. But here's what I think is the worst part of all this, is that you can have people encourage you, like you. You can even have a lot of friends, people that just love being around you, and you can still feel unloved. You can still feel lonely. And the reason is, I've come to understand this, and this has just been a lot of reflection and deep thought on my own part, is what happens is I say, yeah, you like this version of me. You want to spend time, and I have lots of friends who want to spend time with me, but none of you know the real me. None of you know what I really feel, what I really think, what I really struggle with. And so nobody knows me, so then how can you really love me? Because I've not really let you know me. Now all that I've just said is incredibly significant when it comes to this week's I am statement. So we've been studying these statements of Jesus, these identity claims that Jesus makes. And we talked about the fact that Jesus is the door. He's the way to life, true life. That we have lots of choices of what door to enter in, but he says he is the only door that has life and life abundantly. We talked about Jesus as he calls himself the bread of life, that he's the only one who can truly satisfy and sustain us. We talked about Jesus being the way, the truth, and the life. That there's lots of lies out there in our world, but that Jesus proclaims himself not just to have truth, but to actually be truth. We talked about Jesus being his claim to be the good shepherd, the one who wants to lead us and protect us and take us to where we need to go. And today, we're going to look at this proclamation, this declaration of Jesus that has to do with the fact of the real, authentic you. And it's this proclamation that he says in John chapter 8, verse 12. John chapter 8, verse 12. It says, when Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am, there's that I am, the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Now, as I studied this week, I was thinking there's lots of ways I can go with this, right? We could talk about light in a sense of bringing hope, right? When things look dark, light shines in darkness, and it brings a sense of hope. We could talk about light in the sense of it showing the way. It's like a flashlight down a dark path, right? The light shines and shows you the way. We could talk about light in the sense of insight or wisdom, right? You've I'm sure had these moments in your life where you're like, boom, like the light bulb goes on, right? You feel enlightened about something. And I thought, we could go that angle. So there's so many angles to this idea of light. But I chose a different angle than probably what most preachers would do with this topic. And the reason I chose it is because of the context that this verse shows up in. And for those of you who don't know, what context means is what are the verses before and what are the verses after the verse that you're looking at. So if you look at one verse, then you say, well, what are the verses that come right before it? So in John chapter 8, verse 12, he talks about the light of the world. But then in verses 2 and following, there's this powerful story that leads up to his proclamation of being the light of the world. So in verse 2, it says, at dawn he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees, these are the religious leaders of the day, they brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group. You can imagine this. This woman was caught not having had an affair, not someone who had committed adultery in her past. No, what the verse tells us is she was caught in the very act of adultery. So you can imagine this woman barely probably has any clothes on. She's just grabbing whatever she can grab as she is grabbed by these men out of this position that she was in, this very vulnerable position, and now she's thrown. Here's this woman who is now in front of all of these people in the middle of Jesus' teaching, and she is just thrown into the middle of this religious gathering, feeling anything but religious at this point. And she is thrown there. Just get yourself in the scene. By the religious people. By the church people. The ones that talk about the love of God all the time. They are the ones who grab her and throw her in front of everyone, having been caught in the act of adultery. And it says, in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? What do you say, Jesus? Here's this woman we found, caught in the very act of adultery. And if you know the story, Jesus kneels down in some sand and he starts writing in the sand. And it has not kept kind of scholars and biblical people to try to figure out, well, what was Jesus writing? And some people think he was writing the sins that these people in the around had committed. Some people think he was writing the names of the people they were with outside of their marriages. We don't really know what he was writing. But whatever he was writing, he stood up and he said, if any of you is without sin, you cast the first stone. Yeah, you're right. We're supposed to stone this woman. So let's take all the people who are perfect and have you guys start throwing stones. And if you know the story, one by one, starting with the oldest religious leaders, they drop their stones and they walk away. And then the young leaders, they see their older leaders going first and they say, oh, we got to get out of here. And so they leave. And then there's this powerful statement by Jesus in verses 10 and 11, leading up to verse 12, which we just read. Jesus straightened up and he asked this woman, he looks around, right, at the people that had just accused her, judged her. Woman, where are they? Where are they? Has no one condemned you? Is there nobody here who's here to condemn you? And she looks around. Well, no one, sir. Then Jesus says to her, then neither do I condemn you. Now go now and leave your life of sin. Notice he doesn't say, go now and be perfect. He says, this way you've been living, this path you've been living, that you have been choosing to try to find life outside of me, leave that life and choose a life of following after me. Choose a life of seeking to do what's right rather than to live in this life of sin. Jesus sees her for who she really is and invites her to a different way of living. So, think of that, keep that in your mind as the backdrop for what we're going to talk about today. 3 thoughts for you. First is this: Jesus is the light of the world. Jesus is the light of the world. Now, when Jesus proclaims that in verse 12, right, John 8:12, he says, I am the light of the world. Jesus is proclaiming this to these people. He's saying, this is my identity. This is who I am. I am the light of the world. And immediately, a good Jewish person is going to think back to Genesis chapter 1, the very first verses of the Bible. I don't know if you remember in Genesis 1:1, you have the world before the world was created. It says all was dark and formless. And it says the Spirit of the Lord hovered there. And then God declares, let there be, anybody remember? Light. Yeah. So when Jesus says, I am the light of the world, what he is saying is, I am God. I am the one who took what is formless and gave it form. I took what had no structure and gave it structure. I took what was all dark and made it light. Jesus is saying, I am the light of the world. I am the one who brings that light to the world. And then in John chapter 12, verse 46, he says, I have come into the world as a light so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. So Jesus is saying, not only am I the light to shine hope, but I'm also someone who shows a different way of living life. That you don't have to live, as he said to this woman caught in the very act of adultery. He says, you can go and leave your life of sin, leave the way of life this way to walk in the light. And then in John chapter 3, verse 19, it says, this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. So a bunch of people are moving through life thinking this is the way life is found, and they are refusing to turn around and choose light, so they create this world where they think they're getting satisfaction in life, but they are not getting it there. And then in Psalm chapter 27, verse 1, we're going to look at lots of scriptures today, but it says, the Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life, of whom shall I be afraid? Now just leave that up there for a moment, Clay. Because I want you to look at this, and I want you to think about the way I started our time together, of that false self. That self that is created out of what? Out of fear. Fear of what? Fear of being rejected. Fear of not being accepted. Fear that if you knew the real me, then you wouldn't want to be, and I'd be all alone, and no one would care. I would be depressed. I would be anxious. If you knew the real me, the real fears. And I love this because when you understand what Jesus means when he says, I am the light, it is not something to be afraid of. But you notice in the verse we just read before, that people run from the light or choose to reject the light because their deeds are of the darkness. They want to live in this way that is not who God made them to be. But when you understand what Jesus means when he says, I am the light, then you understand that whom shall I fear? You say, well, what does that mean? Well, think about this. If God sees you completely, that there's nothing you can hide from him, that he knows the thoughts you've had today. Some of you parents, the thoughts you had about wanting to strangle your own children today because they weren't getting ready and they had to tie their shoes on their own. I do, Mommy, I do, right? You're like, just let me do it, we're late, right? You know, that feeling, God knew that feeling. God knew that thought. And I know you didn't really mean it, and he knows you didn't really mean it, but he knew that thought. He knows those things that have happened to you and those things that you have done. He knows your past. He knows your present. He knows your future. And he shines this bright light that he sees it all. Nothing in the dark. Nothing hidden. And as we're going to see in a minute, he accepts you. Even though he knows you. He accepts you. So, think about what this verse then is saying. If he is the light, my light, he sees me fully, and he still accepts me, well then, what am I to fear? Who am I to fear? I don't have to fear rejection because the one who knows me fully loves me and accepts me. Jesus is the light of the world. How much of our lives are dominated by fear? But when you know you're loved, you can step forward. See, the reason we are afraid is because we're not secure. We don't feel safe. I don't know about you, but I have a tendency when I'm scrolling through Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is, sometimes there are these videos, and I don't know if they're real or not, but they're like of these people in really high places, and they kind of show their camera down. And I don't know about you, but when I look at these, I don't know why I click on them. I don't even know why I click on them, because I am deathly afraid of heights. But as soon as I click on them, immediately I watch the video, and they show this like down a very high skyscraper building, and there's somebody standing on the edge of the building, right? And immediately my stomach is like in my throat. Anybody else? Am I the only one who's afraid of heights? Okay, you get that, right? And you're like, I know I'm safe. It's just my phone. But for some reason, it gives me this feeling of being completely unsafe right now. Because I'm thinking, that guy's going to die, right? That guy's going to fall. And then you're like, wait a second, how would the video ever get made if he fell? I don't know, right? And this is the way, my friends, most of us live our lives. We don't feel safe. We don't feel secure. We go through life with this sense, always afraid. Who's going to reject me next? What's going to happen next? We live our lives with this sense of, oh my goodness, what's gonna go wrong next? Look at all the things that have gone wrong in my life, and I know something else is gonna happen. We live with this fear. But when you understand the security that's found in a relationship with Jesus, then you begin to say, of whom shall I be afraid? Whom shall I fear if the one who knows me fully loves me fully? So Jesus is the light of the world. Second thing is that Jesus wants to connect with the real me. So yes, he accepts you. Yes, he loves you. But he also doesn't force himself on you. So what I've realized, and I told you that I lived with this false self for so many years, so many decades of my life, is that I realized God will respect my boundary if I choose to say, God, you just stay with my false self. That's where he will stay. And so if I choose to go around hiding certain things about me, or being ashamed of certain sins or decisions that I've made in my life, but the great news is, when I choose to confess, when I choose to go there and let God into those deep, dark places of my soul, that he actually wants to connect with me at that point. God really is not that interested in connecting with this false view of you, this image that everybody else seems to connect with. He wants to connect with the real us. You say, well, where do you get that? Well, I want you to look with me at Psalm 32. It says, blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven. So, blessed, happy, fully favored is the one who doesn't need to fear, whose transgressions, who the deep, dark parts of us that nobody else seems to know, God knows and God forgives. It says, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them, in whose spirit is no, what's the word? Deceit. He says, blessed is the one who can live life without having to hide anything, without having to project any image, without having to tell a half-truth or color the truth in a certain way. How cool would it be to live without any deceit? Notice what he says in verse 3. He says, when I kept silent, meaning I didn't share, I didn't let God into the darker parts of me, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. You ever been there? Where you're just like, something doesn't feel right. It's like you know who you are, but you're not being authentic, you're not being real, and there's just like this sense in your spirit like, something's off. He's like, my groaning all day long, for day and night, your hand was heavy upon me. He's saying, I want to know you. I want to connect with the real you, and you're hiding, you're deceiving. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Then I acknowledged my sin to you. I love this. Then I let you in, and I did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. But think back to the book of Genesis again, and Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, they commit the first, what we will call sin, by choosing to step outside of what God wanted for them, and they take that forbidden fruit, and God goes looking for them, and what do? They hide. They construct fig leaves to protect themselves because they now think they're naked and they're vulnerable and they're ashamed. And God says, where are you, Adam? And Adam's hiding from God. You ever hide from God? Maybe today you're hiding from God. You're thinking somehow that God doesn't know. Like that if you just like, oh, well, I'm not telling God about this. Like this isn't coming up in prayer. Maybe he won't know if I don't bring it up because he's not God or anything. All right? But we do this. We play this little game with God. Like, oh, God, the cups are moving. You know, which one is it under, God? I'm going to hide all these things from you. God's like, I see it. He saw Adam and his sin. And when Adam finally said, here I am, and then he starts blaming everybody else, because none of us would ever do that. Well, right? I'm a really good person. It's just this wife of mine. I mean, man, she is just a bad influence. You know, it's just the parents. See, my parents didn't hug me enough, and because of that, I've chosen this other life of outside of what you want for me. But I always tell people, I'm like, here's Adam and Eve. They had the best parents. Did you notice that? Like Adam and Eve, like their parents never made a mistake. They were the perfect parents. So they had so what do? They blame each other. Well, it's him. No, it's her. No, it's this serpent. It's this serpent, right? That's what's really going on here. But once they come clean, it says that God kills an animal and creates clothing for them. God does. The one who they just sinned against. He creates clothing for them. Yes, they have to leave the garden because they can't live forever in this state of sin, but he covers them. And I want you to know that is our God, this gracious, loving God who even will honor the fact that there's parts of you that you know others may not be able to handle and may not be appropriate for you to share with others. He says, I'll cover that. I'll cover that sin. I'll cover that shame. It's the fact that he does it once and for all by giving his blood as a covering of your sin. He sacrifices himself so that you and I can live. He wants to connect with the real you. So what's keeping us from connecting with the real God and letting God connect with the real us? It's us. He will only go as deep as you're willing to invite him in. But I'm telling you, you will only experience, not that he loves you less, but you only experience his love to the level that you invite him in today. He's the light of the world. He sees it all anyway. And if you allow that light to go into those darker parts of you, some of you have experienced horrific pain and hurt at the hands of somebody else. Some of you have been abused and hurt. Some of you have experienced rape. Some of you have experienced hurtful words over years and years and years, telling you what garbage you are, how you'll never amount to anything. And that hurt is deep, that woundedness is deep within your heart. And some of you, out of that woundedness, have tried to make the best of it and have chosen a life outside of what God has for you and have made choices that you regret. And some of you are walking around today feeling so unlovable and so ashamed and so beaten down and so unsafe to share this with anybody else that I want Jesus' proclamation of his identity to you today to change everything for you because it can. He says, yes, I'm the light of the world. And yes, I see it all. My light reveals it all. But I accept you. You are fully known. You are fully seen. Even those parts where you wondered if God was really there. Even those times where it was so painful that you thought, there's no way God could allow this to happen. He saw you. He knows you. And He accepts you. And He loves you. And when you experience His love to the deepest part of who you are, it will change everything. Because the third thought today is that Jesus invites us to live freely in the light. Jesus invites us to live freely. Look with me at 1 John chapter 1, verses 5 and following. It says, "This is the message we have heard from Him, and we declare to you, God is light. In Him there's no darkness at all. If we claim to have fellowship, connection with Him, and yet we walk in the darkness, we lie, and we do not live out the truth." Next slide. "But if we walk in the light," meaning I don't have anything to hide, I don't have anything to fear because of His love for me, "as He is in the light, we have fellowship," I know, look at this, "with one another." You want to talk about healthy relationships with other human beings? They happen when you can bring your authentic self, knowing you're already loved fully by God. And if others choose to love you, it's just bonus. But so many of us live for the love and acceptance of other people that we do anything to get other people to notice us and to love us and accept us. And we look for it out there when God says, I have it. Receive my love, and then you can move towards other people. And when they love you back, it's just bonus because you're already fully loved by me. You have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, His Son, purifies us from all sin. If we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Yet, if we confess our sin, we invite Jesus into those dark parts of us. He is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. Comes back to that confessing, cleansing, and pure. So we get to live free. I don't have to pretend anymore. I don't have to try to be something for you. I get to be myself and know that I'm fully loved. Woohoo! I am loved. I don't have to fear anybody. The Lord is the light of my salvation. Of whom shall I be afraid? Therefore, Romans 8, verse 1, therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. I am not condemned. I am fully loved, fully accepted. I'm not judged. Yes, I will tell you right now, human beings will judge you. You will still be judged and criticized. But when you know you are fully loved, you can step into even environments where you are judged by others and know that you don't have to be afraid of it because of His love for you. He sees you, He knows you. And the big idea today is connect the real you with Jesus and live in the light. Connect the real you with Jesus and then choose to live in the light. So, what parts of your life have you not invited Jesus into? Some of it's not sin, necessarily your sin. Some of it's somebody else's sin that they've committed against you. And it's produced woundedness in you. Have you invited Him to heal you? Some of you, in response to your woundedness, hurt people, right? And so you've done things that have hurt others. And you need to confess that and invite Him into that. So connect Jesus with the real you. What parts of you do you need to invite Jesus into today? And then secondly, once you receive His acceptance and love, then step into and live into the light. Walk in the light with no fear, that you can be truly who you are. Now, by the way, I'm not giving you a pass to go around acting like a jerk. Like, who cares what you think? Jesus loves me. So you're a loser and you're a loser, right? No, that's not what I'm saying, right? I'm not saying we just throw off all restraint and we now be jerks to everybody, because that's not walking in the light. But of course I'm going to love you. And when you love me back, I'm going to enjoy it. I'm going to be grateful for it. But I don't need it. And I'm not going to try to be something or create a version of myself that you will like, because I'm already fully loved. Does that make sense? I know I'm kind of walking on a line here, but I hope you're understanding what I'm trying to say when I say walk in the light. All right, so what we like to do at the end of message series like this is we like to end the sermon a little bit earlier and give you an opportunity to respond through something that we call our worship stations. Because here's the reality, and I recognize this pretty early in my ministry career, is that not everybody worships through song. I know most churches, that's the only option you've got. If you want to worship God, you got to sing. And some of us are like, I'm kind of insecure about my voice, or I don't like to sing too loud, or I'm not really expressive that way. And so from time to time, I like to provide other opportunities for us to worship God through other means other than just singing. And so we're going to do that today, and I want to walk you through what we would call our worship stations. And in a minute or two, I'm going to give you an opportunity to just move around the room and respond to God in some very real ways.